Hello, Environmental Policy 1 students. Dr. Conway back for Theme 3, Environmental Policy, Law, and Institutions, of which there are 5 subject weeks under this theme. Week 6 is Historical Context. Week 7 is Understanding Basic Environmental Law Design. Week 8, Law at Different Levels of Government. Week 9, Institutional Agreements Implemented at the National Level. And Week 10, Practice at Identifying Legal Obligations. This is Week 6, Historical Context, and the entire purpose of this week is just to sensitize the student to the fact that understanding policy, law, regulation is more than just a legalistic or institutional approach. There's a broader political, institutional, scientific, and economic context for all policy, law, and regulation development. And if you do not understand those contextual factors, it's very, very difficult to understand why policy, law, and regulations were developed the way they were and why they have or have not been effectively implemented. Because law of all kinds emerges out of political trade-offs in an institutional context that is further embedded in a political economic context. And those factors determine a lot about what policy, law, and regulation looks like. In Canadian history, we've seen a number of different phases of the implementation or the development and implementation of environmental law. And in some of those periods, we can say that the environment was fairly ascendant. It was doing well. In other periods, we can say that it wasn't doing well at all. And to understand those ebbs and flows, you need to understand that political, institutional, scientific, and economic context. If you don't, then you won't be very effective at being a policy analyst in the area of the environment. And this includes both the development of these things and their implementation, and that's important to keep in mind. And the way to think about these things could be kind of in four categories. Governments go through different periods, historical periods, where their tolerance for environmental degradation ebbs and flows. In some cases, that's explained by just ignorance, the lack of good science, the lack of awareness, the lack of findings that support the need for action on an environmental problem. In other cases, there's lots of awareness, but the tolerance of environmental degradation still remains high because the economic and political pressures of the day are such that progressive action on the environment is severely constrained. And you can look at Canadian history that way in a number of different cases. For example, just even in the recent period, looking at just the climate change file, for example, we just went through 9 years of the Conservative government under Prime Minister Harper, where you could barely get the climate change recognized in any meaningful way. Suddenly, the Trudeau government is elected, the Liberal Trudeau government, who prioritized the climate change because their constituency was different than the Harper government's was. And suddenly, the climate changes come to the fore in the political agenda again. Yet, in that transition, no environmental policies, laws, or regulations had yet been changed. So the same policies, laws, and regulations were on the books, but the dynamic of the issue transformed completely. And tolerance for it transformed radically. Now, if the follow-through under the Trudeau government is the way it should be, then we should see new policies, laws, and regulations emerge. But the point being is that we didn't need that to actually transform the level of exposure that the issue was getting. And it's really important to understand that political dynamic of how tolerance for the environment changes because of scientific, institutional, economic factors, and obviously political constituencies. And another important thing to understand both the development of policy, law, and regulations and their implementation is what is the political institutional context of that? Is there a lot of rivalry between institutions or departments or ministries within the government? Does one set of ministries opposing the environment enjoy a lot of political credence at the moment relative to the environment, or vice versa? Because governments are not monolithic blocks, right? everything that gets developed out of government is always a negotiation. It's always a political power play. It's always agents using political, social, and economic and scientific arguments to try to make their point and to try to move the agenda in the direction that they want to move it in. For example, in developing countries where I've worked for some 20-something years on environmental issues, one of the major problems is that the environment institutions are just so weak that they're unable to overcome the counter pressure of mining ministries, economic ministries, or industry ministries, even fisheries ministries, ironically, and so on. So they're unable to move the agenda forward. Or if they get good policy, law, and regulation on the books because they've got international cooperation from a developed country to help them do that, the implementation is so weak because the institutions are never mobilized strong enough to actually do a good job in implementation. So governments are not monolithic blocks. Governments have a whole pile of competing interests going on within their system at any given time. And that political institutional context is critically important to understanding why policy, law, and regulation was developed, not developed, the way it was developed, and how it is implemented. Okay? And we can see that, you'll see that in some of the readings of just the Canadian experience and in the portions of my book that I did with Bruce Dern on the greening of Canada federal institutions and decisions. And a lot of this, it can also be explained by just the political constituencies out there. Very difficult to get anything done on the environment if there's not a broad political constituency out there pushing hard for it. Environmental groups, social movement groups, women's groups, whatever the case may be, pushing for improved environmental performance. Because something is needed to counter the economic dynamic to just encourage economic growth and worry less about the environment. That sort of conflict is going on virtually every day in government. And you need to understand the weight and counterweight and how that changes over time of these forces within government to truly understand how environmental policy, law, and regulation develop, the way it's developed, and the way it's implemented. And then there's the institutional capacities within environmental ministries themselves. I mean, what kind of capacities do they actually have to develop policy, law, and regulation and implement it? A lot of the times, even without the counteracting forces within a government as a whole, I mean, the department ministries themselves are just unable to push the agenda very well because they lack scientific capacities to prove their scientific point. They lack capacity to develop sound, fundamental, achievable policy. And they cannot make viable economic arguments that link environment and economy and show that it's a benefit to both the environment and economy to move forward on these environmental policy issues. So their internal institutional capacity is too weak, and they need capacity development to be able to move the agenda forward. So again, might be great policy, law, and regulation on the books, but if the department doesn't have the capacity to implement that, then it's not going to move forward. Okay. And then we can also explain the environmental policy, law, and regulation development and implementation through periods of different types of environmental problems. How complex were the environmental problems? How much did those environmental problems come into conflict with economic interests? For example, in the early days of environmental policy, when we had in institutions, when we had almost nothing in the early 60s, there was all of a sudden a big uproar and there was a lot of movement in environmental policy. Why was that? Well, the first generation of environmental issues was very visible. Okay, it was eutrophication of waters due to fertilizers. Lakes and rivers started to become bogged down in weeds and so on because we dumped too much BOD, bioxygen demand, to plant life in the rivers and lakes. Another major issue that rose was SO2, the dying of lakes due to acidification, the dying of trees due to acidification. And then there's, the dying off of birds and insects due to pesticides, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962. So you can understand the historical period. All of a sudden, these were issues that were not difficult scientifically. They were very visible to the public. And there was a lot of common interest between the environment and economy to address these issues because they also did a lot of economic damage. So you saw this explosive movement in environmental policy going forward because of those dynamics. But we have other historical periods where that was not the case. The recent period, like I say, with climate change, we have lots of scientific evidence that it's a serious issue, but it's not as easily visible to the public. It's not immediate to the public. There's a lot of conflict with economic interests, okay? And so progress on it has been painfully slow. In fact, during the Harper years, they didn't even want to consider it. Then we had to transition to the Liberals, and let's see how far they can consider it to overcome those political economic constraints, which is not going to be easy to do, but it has to be done. So you need to look at environmental policy and its development in a more sophisticated way than just what's on a piece of paper. Good policy analysts in the area of the environment are also political economists. I mean, they understand the political and economic and institutional context within which environmental policy, law, and regulation must be developed and implemented. And one of the important things to keep in mind in that is the division of responsibility in implementation between government and the public. A lot of people think, they have this simplistic notion where environmental policy is all about what's done within government, and the only thing the public can do is pressure government to do things. In reality, however, understanding environmental policy is understanding how well divisions of responsibilities are actually being handled. No government will ever have the capacity, the numbers of people, the resources, and so on, to be in all places for all things related to the environment. So in reality, the government has to set the framework of environmental policy, law, and regulation for things to occur. But a lion's share of the implementation is not done by government. It's done by the public. It's done by corporations that have to comply, by organizations that have to comply, by individuals that have to comply. So that's an important notion for people to understand. Yes, we need to pressure government for policy, law, and regulation change. But the implementation of that, government can do two things. It can do compliance promotion to raise the awareness of private citizens, and it can do enforcement in egregious cases. But enforcement, if you have to enforce, there's a saying in environmental policy that if you have to enforce, you've already failed, because enforcement is very difficult to do. It's very costly. So the main emphasis of any government program needs to be on compliance promotion. Why? Because most of the actual implementation of improved environmental performance is not done by the government. It's done in the private sector. It's done by the public. Okay? So you need to understand how, because of that, the broader political, economic, and institutional dynamics in society can have such a major impact on how successful we are in implementing environmental policy, law, and regulations. Okay, so I want you to keep these things in mind when you do your reading for the week, and try to understand the issues in this broader political economic framework, and this broader understanding of how scientific uncertainty can have a major impact on environmental policy. For example, what have you noticed about the climate change file with respect to scientific uncertainty? You've had a denier community out there, a climate change denier community out there that has tried to pick apart the science and try to claim that the science is incredibly uncertain, therefore no action is yet justified. Whereas on the other side of the equation, you have the IPCC and other science bodies saying that the science is really strong and there isn't that much uncertainty. We know that it's caused by it's anthropogenic sources that are causing the problem with climate change, and that action is warranted. So you could see that there was a whole political economic battle that was occurring around the science itself. So another key issue to keep in mind is, what degree of scientific uncertainty exists or can be claimed to exist around an issue to either inhibit or to foster action. Okay? In addition to these political economic dynamics. So when you read the week's readings, keep these broader contextual factors in mind, because these will be critically important areas for understanding environmental policy, law, and regulation going forward from your course of study here. Okay? So we'll talk to you again next week. Enjoy the readings.